It's been a little while since we've done a last call due to technical difficulties / being busy. So hopefully we can get more of these out in the future.
We're gonna start. We can use this as a kickoff to season 2.
Love it.
Should we record a video or anything, or just?
Yeah, go ahead and give your pitch for season 2 into the camera. It's still rolling.
Oh, pitch. So I think we're 30 episodes in on. So we're 30 episodes in on all of our social media platforms: Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. So this is going to be our official kickoff to season 2 of Last Call. We had a lot of fun on season 1, learning, kind of our first go at podcasting. So with season 2, we hope the conversations stay just as, go down, have the deeper conversations, the conversations people hopefully aren't, maybe too scared to have on social media or publicly. Maybe we'll be willing to have them. And I certainly hope to have some good guests, both people that agree with us and are willing to talk about the differences. I have a few lined up, so like, subscribe, tell us what do you want us to talk about. Anything from you, Logan?
And I'll be there too.
Logan is I feel like I pose the questions, you provide the philosophy, which I think it works well.
Yeah.
So I'll see you on the next episode, Logan. Sir?
All right, sounds good.
I like it.
The other thing about Marx is you have to remember what was going on in the world when he was writing. If you read about the Industrial Revolution, I totally get it. I get why people were upset and wanted something different and thought there's got to be a better way. Because, you had the city of London was coated with black soot everywhere. People were getting their hands cut off in factories. There was a lot of horrible things going on in those days. And I can get why people would be like, wait a minute, this is no good. We got to figure out a better way to do things. But I think it was short-sighted, and I think that, it clearly didn't work out. But, if you had lived in those time periods, you may have been more sympathetic to it, not having the benefit of hindsight. So I give Marx a little bit more slack than I give people who have seen the results of Marxist theories and then continue to support them,
And though I feel like, is there any big names? I feel like even Lenin, if you look at Lenin's views, he was an evil person, to my opinion.
Yeah.
There was no redeeming quality I can find looking at it. But even he didn't have a lot of history to go off of. But his worldview was just so despotic.
Yeah.
And just his view of everything was materialistic.
Well, there's a difference between a dictator and just a philosopher who just can sit in their easy chair and say, maybe this would be good. Let's think about that. And that's what Marx was. Marx just sat around. He never had a job in his life. He never did anything. He just sat around and thought and was like, well, what about this? Maybe we should try that.
He technically committed no sin.
And then not Lincoln, Lenin and Stalin and all those other people put it into practice in a brutal way. So but yeah, it's easy to say those things from the comfort of your own home. It's another thing to do that when you're actually killing people, which is what Lenin and Stalin did.
If you never leave your house, no matter what your ideas are, you will live technically a virtuous life in that you commit no wrong.
True.
I don't know if it's virtuous because there's no positive action, but you certainly would uphold the don't hurt people, don't take their stuff.
Yes.
Now, the next question is, what are we called to do? And that's the deep philosophical debate that'll never end.
No.
When I was actually, something I've been thinking about, it's going to be a little bit of a pivot, but we've talked about it recently before, that I wanted to kind of revisit with you too, if you don't mind.
Please.
We talked about the idea of something I've been just wrestling with. So the idea of liberty is absolute, and then a presumption of liberty, or liberty up to a point.
Yeah,
and
we were talking about this.
I was thinking about it recently again too, and the Murray Rothbard, in his one, I forgot which book it was, in one of the chapters, he makes a very strong case for liberty is absolute, drills it all the way down to the individual. There's no collective common liberty, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And then I don't know if Adam Smith, it would be fair to say, is argued for a presumption of liberty. Liberty is very, very important. I'm not diminishing it, but at a certain point, it can be infringed upon. And the only kind of simple low-hanging fruit examples I come up with is pollution. I have a factory, I pump pollution in the air.
Well, sure. I mean, these are things that are kind of covered under the non-aggression principle, and the idea of externalities is if you're infringing on someone else's liberty, if you're infringing on someone else's rights, then you don't have the right to do that. And I think that it gets a little bit vague, because Like there's certain infringements on other people's rights that are so minor that I don't think you can realistically prohibit them. And this is kind of what courts are for, to figure out whether those things exist. Like if I'm listening to music in my house and you can hear the music, like I'm sending sound waves into your property, is that a violation of your property rights? Depends on how loud the music is, basically, you know. I mean, from a principled standpoint, it shouldn't depend on how loud the music is. It should be either I'm infringing on your property or I'm not. But from a practical standpoint, you can't ever live a life where you're not infringing on someone else's property in some way. If you if you turn your lights on and the light shines into someone else's house, well, I guess that's technically you're violating their property rights, but you can't never turn lights on because someone else might be able to see it, So I think that there's those kind of issues are things that have to be dealt with on an individual basis and have to be litigated and figured out. Like, did you actually cause any harm here, or is someone just trying to take advantage of you? So,
I think there's a risk,
but it's not really a difference between individual and common liberty. It's a difference between, what really constitutes an infringement on someone else's rights.
Yeah. I think, another example, and this one probably not a great example because I think most of us agree or would be opposed to it in hindsight. But let's look at like the Iraq War. Mm-hmm. We invade Iraq, all the bad that comes with that, the destruction, the death, both on the American side and innocent Iraqi people. But let's say, we removed Saddam Hussein, who was a horrible person. Let's just take it as a given. He was a horrible dictator.
Right.
And now we've left Iraq, quote unquote, the idea was better off. We violated a lot of individual liberty, but was the overall liberty, or I don't know, you want to call it collective liberty, I'm just trying to assign out words.
Yeah.
Could someone come in and effectively argue, well, it was okay to violate some individual liberty because we actually made life better for the overall liberty? And I'm like, those are like, I don't know, I'll stop there before I go any further.
I have two things to say to that. The first is that I don't think it's possible to operate based on that as an ethic, because it requires you to know the effects of your actions with kind of certainty in a way that you can't. So like if you say we're going to invade Iraq and we're going to kill all these people or do whatever we do, drop all these bombs, and it's going to make life better for everybody. Well, you don't know it's going to make life better for everybody. You don't know it's going to make life freer for everybody. All you know is what you're doing. You don't know that the effect of what you're doing is going to be. It could be lots of different things. And so I think it's difficult to make a set of ethics around those kind of ideas, because how do you decide in the moment whether what you're about to do is ethical or not? You have to guess. You have to guess at what's going to happen and say, well, I think this is going to have a good outcome, therefore it's ethical. And that's such a terrible slippery slope where like all these people we were just talking about, Lenin and Stalin and Pol Pot and Mao, they could have been justified their actions by saying that. They could say, well, the ends justify the means, and I'm going to make life better for everybody, so I get to do all this stuff. And then it turns out they were wrong, and it didn't make life better for everybody. It made life much, much worse for everybody. But you can only evaluate that in retrospect. And I think a set of ethics that you can only evaluate in retrospect is very dangerous and bad. I think you should be able to know before you do something, is this the right thing to do or is it the wrong thing to do?
Yeah, I agree with that very much. That's a very well put.
And then the other problem I have with what you said is you made a lot of kind of sweeping collectivist statements that we have to think about what they really mean. Things like, we invaded Iraq to liberate the country. Well, like who's we, Who's the people who actually did it? Countries don't act, governments don't act, militaries don't act, individuals act. There were certain people who went and did certain things. And when you say we invaded, what does that mean? Does it mean we walked on the land in Iraq? Does it mean we imprisoned people there? Does it mean we shot people there? Does it mean we dropped bombs there? Like you need to break it down to this individual level to determine whether an act is moral or not, and say, well, John Smith of America dropped a bomb that killed Ahmed, Muhammad, and terrible stereotypical names. I don't know Arabic names in Iraq. Was he justified in dropping that bomb? Like, you have to evaluate the individual act. And I think you really get cloudy thinking when you start saying things like, oh, America invaded Iraq. Well, like, that doesn't mean anything. Yeah. You have to look at the individual acts to know whether it's moral or not.
To get everyone on board.
Yeah.
We invaded Iraq.
Totally. And like people do this with so many things, and they talk about like immigration. They're like, we have a right to defend our borders. Okay, well, that doesn't mean anything. Like, you have to say, I have a right to shoot a man who walks onto my property. Like, that's the question, what you're really asking. Or I have a right to prevent someone from walking onto my property. Well, then what property are you talking about? Does the United States government own property? Is it communal property? Do we all own it? Like, there's so many questions that raises, but people just make these sweeping statements. We have a right to defend our borders, and it really doesn't tell you anything about whether what we're doing is moral or not.
Yeah. There's definitely, I agree with very much so with that take, especially, thinking about the immigration standpoint too. And then that asks the role of government, because we look at like, we do have, I want to go down the immigration path a little bit on this example.
Sure.
Just because the popular thought, especially on the right, but you look at Bernie Sanders, who's opposed to a lot of immigration too, but or at least he used to be, and now he's just kind of quiet. But they crossed our borders. To your point, whose borders? I mean, yes, I'm a citizen of the United States. The southern border, I recognize it's around Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, okay. But is that the role of government in a way? And then I guess then we get into all the other questions of like, does them crossing the border somehow violate my person or property?
Right.
And then people argue like, oh, they're going to tap into the welfare state. They're going to commit crimes. Da, 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 da. Okay, maybe we can talk about those things and look at those are actually factual statements or not. But then, so like, what's the role of government? Right. The role of government is to protect my property, make sure no one invades it, protect my person, make sure no one takes my life, and a few other things. But I think they're tied to those two. Everything else is tied to those two, like sound money.
Yeah.
Like sound money is tied to my property, and so beyond those two, I don't see much of a role for. If you can present an argument where an immigrant or just another person is crossing the river between Mexico and Texas somehow threatens my property or person, all right, now we can have a conversation, I guess.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a complicated issue, and I'll tell you my view on it, which is not representative of anyone else on the Free the People staff's view necessarily. But I always break everything down to the individual level. So the way I think about it is, well, if someone is here and someone has agreed to give them a job, say, you can work in my factory, I'll pay you to do it. And someone has agreed to rent them an apartment, you can live in my apartment building, I'm fine with that. Why is it anybody else's business? You know, what gives you the right to go in and take them and grab them and arrest them and detain them and send them to another country if they're here and everyone who's interacting with them is happy for them to be here and is voluntarily letting them have a place to do it in terms of an individual? And then the other way I think about it is like, well, if say I'm walking along a beach and someone washes up in a raft, it's like, I'm hungry and I'm tired and I'm fleeing my country, which is persecuting me, and I'm landed on this beach. Like, what gives me the right as an individual to push him back and say you can't stay on this beach unless I own the beach, which I don't. I don't own any beaches. What gives me the right to tell him you can't land on the beach? You know? And so again, I think people think about it as this collective thing. They're like, well, there's a border crisis. There's the borders are porous, and they say all these kind of vague things. But I just don't know what gives anybody the right on the individual level to tell someone they can't be here as long as they're not actively infringing on your life or your property.
Yeah, the argument too, like the up to the point argument, like you have there's liberty up to the point argument versus the absolute. I feel like that is where all the contention really comes in, because a lot of the big complaint with politics today is like, man, we get so wrapped up in the social issues. That's where all the red meat is. Whenever we also decide to invade or infringe on any kind of fiscal issue or intervene in the market or whatever, justify some kind of regulation, I feel like if you dig deep enough, there's some like underlying like social reason why we want to do it. People aren't behaving correctly. People aren't virtuous. We have to invade over here to fix them over here.
Yeah.
So I think the debate always comes to this point argument, so it's tough to ignore it. That's kind of what the conclusion that I've come to. Like, I think almost the general population believes into the up to the point argument.
Yeah, I think you're right. People don't have these like bedrock principles that they say, well, this is the line I won't cross. They say, well, they have a much more pragmatic view, I guess, where they say, well, yeah, liberty is fine, but then when it starts to annoy me, then no more liberty.
Yeah. Check some Japanese whiskey.
Yeah, I'd like a little bit more. Thank you. What do you think of the Macallan?
I thought it was very good, very smooth.
Really tasty. I thought it was very good.
Sorry.
And I have just like different way of looking at it. I think of things from the bottom up, and I think, well, here's my principle that I start with, and then I look at every individual act based on that principle and evaluate whether it's good or bad based on that principle. And I think other people work backwards or work the opposite way from the way I work, where they look at the act and decide whether they like it or not, and then derive their principles from that, which I think is a wrong way to do it personally.
More of the end.
A little bit more ad hoc.
Yeah.
You know?
Very much so. We're willing to suspend some principle, which then is it a principle anymore? If you're willing to suspend it for convenience.
Yeah, it isn't.
But yeah, I think the overall pursuit with public policy. Here's one of my big contentions, especially with this up to the point argument. I think all our arguments in politics can be drilled down to everyone, wherever you fall on the political spectrum or think you fall. wants or is striving for a virtuous society. And I know I overuse that word, but they want a moral, almost utopian.
Yeah, but I think people have a different definition of what virtuous
Yeah, the
means.
definition is fluid, but that's kind of what everyone wants in the back of their mind. And I think we honestly have invested too much I believe we've invested way too much in politics to bring about this.
You're right.
And so we're like, we'll fix it with a good policy, with electing the right people, and then everything else will fall into place. And I know we at Free the People adamantly believe in culture being upstream of politics.
Yep.
The one question I really want to explore is, I agree with it, and I think there's absolutely culture has a bigger impact on politics. But I also wonder, how often does politics feed into culture a little bit too? I think my hypothesis is politics can erode culture more than it can lift it up. So it does have an effect on it, but it's usually a negative effect, if anything.
Yeah, I
don't know if
I
that's
agree.
true.
I don't really know.
That's my hypothesis.
I don't really know what it means to have a negative or a positive effect on culture. Like, culture is what it is, and so I don't know if you can degrade or uplift culture. You can make culture move in different directions, and you can be happier or less happy with the directions it moves in. But I don't know if there's like a good culture and a bad culture kind of thing.
I would argue probably there is. I think from my philosophy, I think there's objective truths, and of course my Catholic faith kind of helps form what I believe those objective truths are. And I believe culture culture and social institutions like the family and communities and local things that influence children's lives and your lives growing up help build that more than some policy ever will. And the policy will get in the way of my family interacting with my church, my neighborhood in ways that it needs to, or it should, or there's a responsibility upon my family and me as an individual to do certain things that should not be infringed upon, I think. I think, and this isn't a responsibility that should be written into law. I think it's a natural law type responsibility.
Well, a big problem is that I don't think we have
Squirrel?
We have a lot of unshared ends. It's not like we're all looking for the same thing, and therefore if we can agree on the means to get there, then we'll be fine. Like, I think a lot of people want different ends. And there's certain things that we all have in common, but I think there's a lot of things that we don't. And so one person's idea of a virtuous society is going to be different from another person's. And so you can't even argue about, how are we going to get to the virtuous society until you agree upon what the goal is, what the end goal is.
And I think, especially as we grow, I think when you have more of a homogeneous society, which maybe in 1776 when everyone hailed from England, for the most part.
Yeah.
Sure, you have more of some shared values, but we've grown as a country. We're 330 million strong. People from across the globe come here for a better life, for liberty. I mean, just moving from this one side of the El Paso, or the Rio Grande, the river.
Yeah.
El Paso, that is on the Rio Grande or on the border. But just moving from the Mexican side to the American side, a person can increase their wealth by 5 times. So people are coming from all across the world. So we need some kind of shared values, but I'll agree with you this. It should be, there are only a few that I think we need. I think if we truly believe in the mantra of Matt Kibbe's, which I think is Adam Smith, don't hurt people, don't take their stuff, private property right.
Yeah.
And you always say, build your culture.
Yeah.
For me, I want to build a Catholic culture. I can do that with my family, my community, my friends from church.
Yeah.
Live it. There should be no one stopping me. If it's better, more people will join it. They'll be like, whoa, that's got a really good idea going on over there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I shouldn't need to run to the state.
No.
But the state should.
I mean, I think that, like, the cultural differences, if you talk about values, are greater within our country than they are without of our country, if that makes any sense. Like, I always hear people complain about immigrants and saying, well, we can't have Mexicans coming in here and changing our culture and having them be all communist and stuff. But I'm like, I don't see the communism coming from Mexico or from any Latin American country.
El Salvador.
I see it coming from American universities, from white people, To me, that's where it seems to be coming from.
Communism's European.
It is European. That's true. It's German.
It's our heritage.
Yeah, but all the crazy woke stuff, that's not coming from immigrants. Not even close. It's coming from American white students in universities. And so I never bought into the argument that, like, that's the reason we need to close our borders is to protect our culture from being influenced. And I'm like, I don't think that's where it's coming from.
I want a few more people to come here that are, get out of my way, I'm going to roll up my sleeves and get to work.
Yeah.
Versus the,
totally.
Oh, we just need to rearrange society so everyone's fair and everyone gets a paycheck. Like,
yeah.
All right, how undignifying is that proposal?
Mm-hmm. Fairness is another one of those weaselly words where no one has the same definition of
which one?
Fairness.
Fairness. Yeah.
No one really knows what they mean when they say fairness. They're like, I just want the thing that I want, and that's fair.
It's like equality too. You always have the fairness, equality. for me, equality is equal opportunity. Like there should be no roadblocks.
The thing I was thinking about earlier is, there's all this like hatred of billionaires and stuff going around, but then there's this complaining that like workers aren't getting paid enough and workers aren't wealthy enough. And like I saw a thing today about how millennials only hold like 5% of the wealth of the country, and baby boomers held 21% of the wealth back when they were young, and how terrible that is. And so my question is like, how much money are you allowed to make where you can stop complaining about not making enough money, but then you don't have to like guillotine yourself for having too much money? Where's the sweet spot?
That place, that happy place you want to be.
Yeah. Where's that dividing line?
There's probably is like,
because it seems a little odd that people are complaining about not making enough money and then attacking the people who make money. Like, well, don't you want to be them?
No, well, if it's not you, get them.
Yeah.
And as soon as it's you, how dare you?
I guess so.
I mean, I forgot what book you recommend. I have not read it yet, but it's on envy.
Yeah, it's called Envy. Imaginatively.
Oh, there you go. I think, does Liberty Fund print it?
Yeah, it's by Helmut Schmuck or Schuck or something. It's some weird German name. The first name Helmut always makes me laugh.
You argue that you believe our envy is the worst.
Envy is entirely destructive. There's nothing positive about envy. And so that's why I think it's the worst of the sins. Because like there's benefits to being proud of yourself. Like Christians say that pride is the worst sin. But like there's a lot of good things about being proud of yourself and proud of your family, and pride can do a lot of good. There's a lot of bad that can come from pride as well, obviously, but it can do a lot of good. Whereas envy is just destructive. Envy is not like that motivating, like, oh, I wish I had what he had, I'm going to go strive for it. Envy is just the resentment of people who have done better than you and wanting to tear them down. Jealousy is, they make the distinction in this book between jealousy and envy. Jealousy is I want what you have. Envy is I don't want you to have what you have.
Yeah, it's like ill-wishing upon someone. Like, yeah. I wish, because you have more, I wish terrible things upon you.
Yes, that's what it is. It's resentment of people who have done better than you have. And I think it's such a cancerous emotion that is run rampant in our society. And
we certainly, I know I have had many times a sensation of that, where you have a feeling of like, I can't believe they've had success. I would celebrate if something terrible came upon them.
Well,
you got to catch yourself. Like,
I studied Russian in college, and my Russian professors used to tell me this joke that they heard in Russia. It was like very characteristic of the Russian spirit. There were these two farmers who lived next to each other, and one day the farmer's digging in his field, and he digs up an old, rusty lamp, and he rubs it, and a genie pops out, and the genie says, "I'll grant you anything you want. Wish for whatever you want, and you can get whatever you want." He said, "Well, my next door neighbor's got a cow, and I don't have a cow. So I wish for his cow to die." He doesn't wish for a cow himself. He wishes for his neighbor's cow to die. And that's the envy in a nutshell, You're not helping yourself at all. You're just destroying other people just because you don't like them.
I had to read a paper for grad school on the evil eye, the history of the superstition of the evil eye.
I've got a great book on that.
Do you?
Yeah.
And it's just how a lot of cultures, and they're all from like farming cultures, traditionally agricultural cultures, really believed in the evil eye. And it was that, obviously if someone looked enviously upon your very visible wealth, which was cows, a fruitful bounty of harvest, bad things would come upon you.
Yeah.
So these cultures would actually visibly and purposefully destroy a percentage of their wealth to help prevent an evil eye.
Yeah.
So it was just the idea of envy. If someone looks envious upon me and something battle happens, so I will just proactively and voluntarily destroy 25% of my property.
Yeah, you don't want to stand out too much. Like I actually touch on this in my new book, Conform or Be Cast Out, The Literal Demonization of Nonconformists, available December 1st from wherever fine books are sold. I touch on that a little bit because, I read this book on that superstition a while ago, and it's really interesting because, people who stand out as having a little bit more than others, they put themselves at risk, and so you do better to try to keep your head down. It's interesting, the metal horns.
Yeah.
The metal horns were actually an Italian blessing that were used to ward off the evil eye. It was done like this.
Oh, really?
And the metal singer Ronnie James Dio witnessed his Italian grandmother doing it and thought, that's pretty cool. I'm going to do that in my shows. And he started doing it, and that's where it comes from.
And that's it became a cultural...
Yeah, it's not devil horns at all. It's like, it's get away from me, get behind me, Satan kind of thing.
Interesting.
Ward off the evil eye. Pretty cool.
Interesting. Yeah, the paper was very interesting to see. It made sense. It seemed, it was over. If your neighbor's gonna come over and beat you to death to take your stuff, but burning 25% of it would keep you alive, I'd burn 25% of my
It's
stuff.
probably the origin of a lot of sacrifice cultures. You know, where they sacrifice things to the gods in order not to have bad things befall them. It's probably that.
Yeah.
You know.
Visible destruction of wealth.
Yeah.
Human sacrifice. I'm sure there's something tied to it where you're trying to send a very visible signal to your neighbors. Don't hurt me.
Right.
So, to your point, envy is destructive. It'll even entice you to destroy your own things or not live maybe to your fullest capacity.
Yeah,
I mean, you do it
nothing
all the
good
time.
comes
It's like,
out of
hey,
it.
I'm really good at X, Y, or Z, but I'm going to actually perform at 70% to not have other people look envious upon me.
I've heard stories from that in people in school a lot, like avoid being bullied or picked on. It's like I could get an A+ on every test, but I'm going to go ahead and get a B- on everything on purpose, just so I won't stand out and people won't come after me. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, well, maybe it's convenient.
Yeah.
But
yeah, don't be envious. Drink your whiskey and enjoy your good times.
be free.
Be free.
Cheers, sir.
Cheers.
Good talking to you.
Yeah.